They said winter would decide whether she was worth saving, and by sundown the snow had already started to agree with them. The wagon wheels had barely stopped turning before they pushed her down into the white silence. Not with cruelty anyone could point to, just the cold efficiency of people who had decided someone else's suffering was no longer their concern. The driver never looked back. One of the passengers pulled his coat tighter and muttered that nobody survived alone out here once the temperature dropped below 10 degrees. Another said nothing at all. The horses snorted clouds into the freezing air, their breath rising like ghosts before the wagon rolled away, leaving only tracks that the falling snow began to erase almost immediately. She tried to stand once. Then again, her legs refused to listen. Ice clung to the hem of her dress, stiff as bark. The sky above was the pale gray of coming night, that dangerous hour when the forest stopped feeling like land and started feeling like something endless. Somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked under the weight of fresh frost. She pulled her arms closer to herself, not from fear, but from instinct, the simple human refusal to disappear quietly. Snow gathered on her shoulders, on her dark hair, on her eyelashes. Time passed the way it only does in deep winter, slow enough to feel every second, fast enough to steal the daylight before hope could catch up. Miles away, a different rhythm cut through the stillness. Steel biting into pine, a steady, patient sound. One strike every few seconds. Measured, controlled. The kind of sound made by a man who had long ago learned that talking solved less than working. Ethan Cole paused only when the sound of his axe stopped echoing back the way it should. Men who live alone learn the language of silence. When something changes, even slightly, they notice. His breath rolled out in thick clouds as he listened. Nothing at first, then the distant flight of two ravens lifting from the trees. Not panic, just movement, but enough. He rested the axe against his shoulder and studied the tree line. 5 years alone in these woods had taught him one rule. Nature always tells you when something is wrong. You just have to be willing to hear it. His cabin sat a quarter-mile behind him. Smoke rising steady from the stone chimney. A place built for one man and no more. No extra chair. No second cup. Even the porch had only one set of worn steps. He preferred it that way. People brought noise. Questions. Memories. Trees did not. He started walking, boots pressing deep into 8 inches of fresh powder. Each step making that hollow crunch only heard when the cold settles deep into the bones of the land. Then he saw it. Not her. Not yet. Just something out of place. A line in the snow that wasn't made by wind or animal. A drag pattern. Too straight. Too human. He followed it without speaking, without rushing. Just the quiet patience of a man used to finding what others missed. 50 yards later he stopped. For a long moment, he didn't move at all. Because there she was, half covered by drifting snow like the forest itself had tried to claim her. Still, silent, almost part of the landscape. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows one choice will keep his life simple, and the other will change it. He turned slightly, as if he might leave. Then he stopped, because beneath the winter silence, he thought he saw the faintest movement of breath rising into the frozen air. For a long moment Ethan Cole simply stood there, his gloved hands hanging at his sides, his gray eyes studying the fragile rise and fall of breath that proved she was still alive. He had seen this before. Not the girl, not this exact moment, but the choice. The same quiet crossroads where a man either keeps walking or carries a weight that does not belong to him. The wind pushed through the pines with a low whisper, carrying the scent of frozen sap and distant mountain air. His cabin was warm. His fire was steady. His life was finally simple. Helping meant questions. Questions meant people. And people always meant trouble. He told himself that more than once. His boots shifted in the snow as he turned halfway back toward the direction of his woodpile. One step, then another. The sound of his own movement felt louder than it should have. He stopped again, closed his eyes briefly. 5 winters ago he had buried the last person he ever planned to care about. A small wooden marker still stood behind his cabin beneath a tall cedar tree, facing the sunrise the way she used to like. Since then he had made a quiet agreement with the world. No attachments, no risks, no second chances. Just work, food, sleep, repeat. It was a clean arrangement. It did not hurt. The wind shifted again. When he looked back, he noticed something he had missed before. Her hand. Not reaching. Not begging. just resting against the snow with the fingers slightly curled as if she had been holding on to something invisible. There was dignity even there. Even now, that bothered him more than anything else. People who fought to the end had a way of changing a man if he let them. Ethan let out a slow breath and looked up at the pale sky. The sun was already dropping behind the ridge. Maybe 40 minutes of light left. Temperature would drop another 15 degrees once darkness settled in. Nobody survived that without shelter. Nobody. He muttered something under his breath that no one else was there to hear. The kind of quiet protest a man makes when he already knows he has lost the argument with himself. Then he walked back. This time he did not stop. He knelt carefully, brushing snow away from her shoulder with movements so controlled they almost looked mechanical. Up close he could see frost gathered along the edges of her hair, and the faint color returning to her lips with each shallow breath. Around her neck hung a thin leather cord holding a small turquoise stone wrapped in worn silver wire. Not decoration, not random, meaning. He did not touch it. Some things a man learned to respect without understanding. When he finally lifted her, he did it the way someone lifts something breakable, steady and certain, one arm beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected. That bothered him too. He rose slowly, adjusting his balance, then started back toward the thin line of smoke rising from his chimney a quarter-mile away. Snow continued falling, soft and endless, covering his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. By the time he reached the edge of his clearing, it would look as if no one had passed through it all. Just forest. Just winter. Just one more secret the mountains agreed to keep. The cabin door opened with a slow wooden creak, releasing a wave of heat that carried the smell of burning pine and black coffee that had been sitting near the coals since morning. Ethan stepped inside without hesitation, pushing the door shut behind him with his boot before the cold could follow. Inside, everything was exactly where it had been for years. One table, one chair, one narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Order was the only way a man like him kept his thoughts quiet. He laid her gently across the wool blanket on the bed and immediately moved to the fireplace, adding 2 thick logs with the efficiency of someone who understood that warmth was not comfort out here. It was survival. Sparks climbed upward as the flames answered, light flickering across the rough log walls and across her still face. For a moment, he just watched to make sure her breathing did not stop. In, out, slow but steady. Good. He crossed the room and poured warm water from a dented iron kettle into a tin cup, letting it cool before bringing it back. When he touched the edge of the cup to her lips, he did not speak. Some people talked too much when they were nervous. Ethan had learned silence carried more respect. At first there was no response. Then a small movement. Just enough. He waited. Patience was another thing the mountains taught. After a few seconds she swallowed. Barely, but it was enough. He nodded once to himself as if confirming a private agreement. You are not done yet. He pulled a chair closer to the bed, but did not sit fully, just rested one hand on the back of it like a man ready to move if needed. Up close he could see she was younger than he first thought. Maybe 20, maybe less. Hard to tell under the exhaustion. The turquoise pendant still rested against her collarbone, the stone catching the firelight with a quiet glow like something that remembered the sun. He recognized the craftsmanship. Apache work. Careful. Intentional. Not something traded in a general store. That explained some things. It also meant complications. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Trouble had a way of finding him even when he stayed 30 miles from the nearest town. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the cabin walls, testing the structure. Like it always did during the deep cold months. The sound reminded him how thin the line was between safety and exposure. He reached for a folded quilt from a wooden chest at the foot of the bed and placed it over her without waking her, making sure her hands were covered. People lost fingers to cold faster than they realized. Another quiet rule of winter. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Time moved differently beside a sickbed. At some point her eyes opened slightly, unfocused at first, then sharpening just enough to notice where she was. She did not panic. That surprised him. Most people did. Instead, she studied him the way someone studies weather, cautious but calm. He remained where he was, hands visible, posture relaxed, offering the one thing trust always started with. No sudden movements. No demands. Finally she spoke, her voice barely more than breath. Where am I? Ethan answered simply. Safe. That was all. Nothing more was needed. Her eyes closed again, not from fear but from exhaustion, and for the first time since he had found her, Ethan allowed himself to sit down fully in the chair beside the bed, the firelight reflecting in his tired eyes as the long night settled in around them. Morning arrived slowly, not with sunlight, but with a pale gray glow leaking through the frost-covered window like the world outside was still deciding whether to wake up. Ethan had not moved much during the night. Years of hard living had trained him to rest lightly, the kind of sleep where a man remains half aware of every sound, every shift in the fire, every change in breathing across the room. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he did was look toward the bed. Still breathing. Still here. Good. He stood quietly and added another split log to the fire, the wood catching with a soft crackle that filled the cabin with that familiar scent of resin and smoke. On the small iron stove, he warmed a simple pot of oat porridge, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon worn smooth from years of use. No spices, no sugar, just food that kept a person standing. When he brought the bowl over, she was already awake, watching him with clearer eyes now. Not afraid, not trusting either. Measuring. That was a look he understood. He placed the bowl on the small table beside the bed and stepped back, giving her space to decide. After a moment, she pushed herself up slightly, wincing only from stiffness, not injury, and accepted the spoon with steady hands. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like someone taught never to show weakness even when exhausted. After a few bites, she paused and looked at him. Why did you help me? The question came simple. Honest. Ethan considered it longer than most men would. Finally, he shrugged once. Because you were there. That was all he offered. No speeches. No hero words. Just truth. She studied his face as if searching for something hidden there, then nodded once as if that answer made sense in a way bigger explanations would not. After she finished eating, she touched the small pendant at her neck, almost unconsciously. Ethan noticed, but did not ask. Instead, he walked to the window and scraped away a thin layer of frost with the side of his hand. Fresh snow had buried most of yesterday's tracks. Clean again. But something else caught his eye. Far off near the tree line, maybe half a mile out, he saw the faint shape of old wagon marks half filled by the storm. Someone had come through recently. He said nothing yet. Behind him, she finally spoke again. My name is Ayana. He nodded slightly. Ethan. Silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Not empty. Just waiting. After a while, she asked quietly, how far from town? 30 miles. Her shoulders relaxed just a little at that answer. That told him more than words. People only relaxed at distance when they had reasons not to go back. Later, as the morning grew brighter, she noticed the small wooden cross shape carved into the beam above the fireplace. Old. Careful work. Someone had taken time with it. Your family? She asked gently. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he walked to the door and opened it slightly to check the sky, cold air slipping in around his boots. Finally, he said, used to be. Nothing more. She did not press. Some grief did not need explaining. Outside, a lone raven crossed the clearing, its wings cutting across the white landscape like a moving shadow. Inside, the fire continued its steady work, and for the first time in many winters, Ethan Cole realized the quiet inside his cabin no longer felt quite as empty as it had the day before. The second day passed with the quiet rhythm of survival, the kind of day where nothing important seemed to happen and yet everything slowly changed. By afternoon, Ayana was strong enough to stand for short moments, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table while she tested her balance like someone relearning how to trust the ground. Ethan did not offer help unless she asked. Pride was something he understood. Instead, he worked as he always did, splitting logs just outside the cabin where the sound could reassure her he was near without forcing conversation. Each strike of the axe echoed steady and predictable, a promise that nothing unexpected was coming through that door. When he returned inside, he found her studying the small details of his life. The repaired handle on his coffee pot, the carefully folded extra blankets, the row of 3 books on the shelf, each read enough times to soften their corners. You live very quiet, she said. Ethan gave a small nod. Quiet is easier. She considered that before answering. Quiet can also be lonely. That made him pause slightly before setting another log near the fire. Maybe. He did not say more. Late in the afternoon, she noticed a small wooden box sitting on the windowsill. Inside were a few objects that clearly mattered. A brass button, a faded ribbon, a simple silver ring hanging from a leather strip. She did not touch them. Instead, she asked, "Your wife?" Ethan did not look at the box when he answered. Her name was Margaret. Past tense. Always past tense. Ayana lowered her eyes respectfully and nodded once. "In her culture," she said softly, "we believe the ones who leave still walk beside us if we live in a way that honors them." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the wall, considering that idea like a man testing the weight of something unfamiliar. After a moment, he said, "She liked spring. Said winter only mattered because it made green things possible again." Ayana allowed a small smile. "That sounds wise." Margaret usually was. The words came easier than he expected. Outside, the daylight began to fade again, painting the snow with long blue shadows. Ayana sat near the fire and slowly braided a loose strand of leather she had found near the hearth, her fingers moving with calm purpose. When she finished, she tied it gently around a small crack in the handle of Ethan's water bucket, reinforcing it without being asked. He noticed immediately, did not comment. But the next time he filled the bucket from the melted snow barrel outside, his grip rested exactly where she had strengthened it. Small things. That was how trust began. As darkness settled in, they shared a simple meal of dried venison and beans warmed slowly over the coals. No ceremony, no speeches, just two people learning the shape of each other's silence. Before sleeping, she spoke one more time, her voice thoughtful rather than afraid. "People who left me believed winter would finish their decision." Ethan looked into the steady fire and answered in the same calm tone. "Winter does not decide who stays alive. People do." Ayana studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if she understood something deeper than the words themselves. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees again, but inside the cabin, the quiet no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like something being rebuilt, one small act at a time. On the third morning, the sky cleared for the first time, revealing a hard blue horizon that only came after the worst cold had passed, the kind of sky that looked beautiful but carried no mercy. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Weather like that meant travelers. Or trouble. Sometimes both arrived together. After breakfast, Ayana was strong enough to step outside, wrapped in one of his spare wool coats that hung loose on her frame. She paused just beyond the doorway, breathing in the sharp winter air like someone returning from a long journey. The snow stretched unbroken across the clearing, smooth and bright under the pale sun. For a moment, she simply stood there, her dark eyes scanning the tree line as if reading something written into the land itself. "You watch the forest like a scout," Ethan said quietly from the doorway. She answered without looking back. "The forest speaks if you know how to listen." That sounded familiar to him. Different words. Same truth. Later, while he repaired a loose hinge on the shed, she walked slowly along the edge of the clearing, careful, alert, stronger with each step. That was when she stopped, her gaze fixed on something most people would never notice. A broken pine branch half buried in snow. A faint depression nearby. She crouched slightly, studying the pattern. When Ethan approached, she spoke calmly. "Riders passed here. Not yesterday. Maybe 2 days. 3 men. One horse limped slightly." Ethan felt a quiet tension settle in his shoulders. He had seen the old wagon trail, but not this. "You certain?" She nodded. Snow tells truth longer than people do. He did not ask how she knew. Some knowledge came from living close to danger. After a moment, she added, "They were not hunting animals. They were searching." That word stayed between them. Searching meant intent. Searching meant return. Back inside the cabin, she finally told him what he had not asked. "The men from the trading post wanted something from my people. They wanted winter supply routes. Safe passes through the mountains. My uncle refused. They believed I would speak if I was alone." Ethan leaned against the table, arms folded loosely. "You did not." She shook her head. "Some things are worth more than comfort." There was no anger in her voice. Just certainty. He respected that. After a long pause, he said, "Those kind of men do not like unanswered questions." Ayana met his gaze steadily. "Neither do mountains." Silence followed, but it was not fear. Just preparation. That afternoon, Ethan moved a few things without explanation. He stacked extra firewood closer to the cabin, brought his tools inside earlier than usual, checked the latch on the door twice instead of once. Ayana noticed every detail, but said nothing. Preparation was another language she understood. As evening approached, she reached into the small pouch at her side, and removed the turquoise pendant. For the first time, she held it out where he could see it clearly. "My father is chief of the Red Mesa Apache." Ethan did not react outwardly, but the weight of that information settled quietly into the room. Important people always brought complicated consequences. She continued, "This stone is given only to those trusted to carry the future of the tribe. They believed leaving me would break that trust." She closed her hand around it again. They were wrong. Ethan studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Yes, they were. Outside, far beyond the trees, a faint shape moved briefly along the distant ridge line before disappearing again. Into the winter light. Neither of them mentioned it, but both had seen. That night the cold returned harder, the kind that made the cabin would contract with soft popping sounds like the forest itself was listening. Ethan did not sleep much. Years alone had trained him to notice changes others would ignore. Near midnight he heard it. Not loud, not close, just the faintest echo of something unnatural carried through the trees. The distant rhythm of hooves packed carefully into frozen ground. Slow, controlled, not travelers. Travelers made noise. These riders were trying not to. He sat up in his chair without lighting another lamp, letting the fire provide just enough glow to see the room. Across from him, Ayana was already awake, her eyes open in the dim light. She had heard it too. Neither spoke. Some moments did not need words. After several minutes, the sound faded again, like whoever had passed was measuring distance rather than arriving. Ethan finally stood and added one log to the fire. Calm movements, nothing rushed. If they were being watched, panic would only invite attention. Morning came heavy and quiet. No birds. No small animal tracks near the clearing. Even the wind seemed to be waiting. Ethan stepped outside first, his boots pressing slowly into the crusted snow, his eyes moving across the tree line with the same patience he used when reading falling timber. At first he saw nothing. Then he saw enough. At the far edge of the clearing, just where the trees began to thicken, 3 sets of tracks stood where the snow had been disturbed. Not approaching, not leaving, watching distance. Ayana stepped beside him a moment later, her voice low. They found the trail. Ethan nodded once. Probably yesterday. Maybe sooner. She studied the tracks carefully. They are not soldiers. Not hunters. Men paid to find answers. That matched his thoughts. Trouble hired always walked differently than trouble born. Back inside, Ethan moved with quiet purpose. He did not reach for weapons. He reached for routine. More water inside. More wood stacked by the door. Coffee prepared early. Survival was not always about fighting. Sometimes it was about showing no fear. Around midday, a shape finally appeared at the edge of the clearing. One rider only. The other 2 remained back among the trees, visible only if you knew where to look. The man who approached did not dismount. He raised one gloved hand, not friendly, not hostile, just claiming presence. Ethan stepped outside, but did not move far from his door. Ayana remained just inside, unseen but listening. The rider spoke first. "We are looking for a girl who passed through this area." Ethan answered simply, "Lots of land out here." The man studied him carefully. "She does not belong in these woods alone." Ethan replied without emotion, "Nobody belongs alone in winter." The rider considered that. Then his eyes moved briefly toward the cabin window. "If she is here, we can take her somewhere warmer." Ethan did not move. "She already is somewhere warmer." Silence stretched between them like a drawn line nobody wanted to cross. Finally, the rider gave a small nod as if filing that answer away. "We will be nearby, in case you reconsider." Ethan answered quietly, "I will not." The man held his gaze 1 second longer, then turned his horse slowly and rode back toward the trees where the others waited like shadows. Ethan remained where he was until they disappeared completely. When he finally stepped back inside, Ayana asked only one question. "Will they return?" Ethan looked at the steady fire before answering. Men who do not get answers always do. The quiet inside the cabin grew heavier, but neither of them looked afraid. Some storms announced themselves long before they arrived. The next morning arrived wrapped in fog so thick the forest looked like it had disappeared, the trees reduced to dark shapes floating in pale gray silence. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Fog like that did not just hide you. It hit everyone. Sound carried differently too. Closer. Stranger. He stepped outside just after sunrise, his breath drifting slowly into the heavy air, his eyes scanning the edge of the clearing where yesterday's tracks had been. They were gone now. Not covered. Erased. That told him something else had passed through during the night. Ayana joined him quietly, her movements stronger now, her posture no longer that of someone recovering, but of someone preparing. She studied the fog for several long seconds before speaking. They are not alone anymore. Ethan did not ask how she knew. Instead, he listened. At first, there was nothing. Then slowly, like shapes forming out of a dream, shadows began to appear beyond the white curtain of mist. Not moving fast. Not hiding. Just arriving. One shape became 3. 3 became 10. Then more. Horses stepping quietly into view. Their riders straight-backed and calm, wrapped in winter hides and painted with markings that spoke of belonging rather than threat. No shouting. No weapons raised. Just presence. Ayana exhaled slowly, something between relief and responsibility crossing her face. They found me. Ethan counted without meaning to. 12. Then 15. Then more shapes holding position between the trees. 20 at least. Maybe more behind them. At their center, one older rider stepped forward, his long gray braid resting over one shoulder, his posture carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed without raising his voice. He stopped his horse at the edge of the clearing and waited. Not demanding, allowing space. Ayana stepped forward until she stood beside Ethan rather than behind him. That choice did not go unnoticed. The older rider placed his closed fist over his chest briefly, then opened his hand toward her in greeting. Daughter. The word carried across the clearing like something heavier than sound. Ayana answered in her own language first, her voice steady, her chin high. Then in English she said, I am safe. The older man's eyes moved toward Ethan then, measuring him carefully, not with suspicion, but with the weight of a father who understood how close winter had come to taking something irreplaceable. You gave her fire, he said simply. Ethan answered the only way he knew how. She needed it. Silence followed. Then the chief gave a small nod, the kind that meant more than long speeches. Behind him, several riders dismounted, not approaching, just standing as witnesses. No reward was offered. No promises spoken. Just recognition. After a moment, Ayana removed the turquoise pendant from around her neck and held it briefly between both hands before placing it back. I told them you asked for nothing. Ethan looked out across the quiet line of riders and said softly, I did not do it for them. She understood. That was enough. The chief spoke again. A debt carried in honor does not fade. Ethan did not answer. Some things were better left to time. As the fog slowly began to lift, sunlight touched the clearing again, revealing the full number of riders waiting with calm patience. Not an army. Not a threat. Something else entirely. Ayana looked once more. At the cabin. At the smoke rising from the chimney. At the man who had changed the direction of her life without asking her name first. Then she stepped toward her people, knowing some paths had to continue forward even when they left something behind. The clearing grew quiet again after they left, the kind of quiet that felt different from the silence Ethan had known before. Not empty, just changed. The tracks of 20 horses marked the snow like a story written without words. Then slowly the wind began softening their edges the way time softens even the strongest moments. Ethan stood there a long while after the last rider disappeared into the trees. He did not wave. He did not call out. Some goodbyes did not need to be spoken. Finally, he turned back toward his cabin. The same rough doorway, the same smoke curling into the pale sky, but something inside him felt less sealed off than before. Days passed. Winter began to loosen its grip a little more each morning. The sun stayed longer by a few minutes. Ice along the edge of the water barrel began to thin, life returning in small permissions. Ethan returned to his routine because routine was how a man kept steady. Chop wood, carry water, mend tools. But sometimes he would pause without meaning to, noticing the second cup still resting on the table, noticing the repaired leather wrap still holding firm on his bucket handle. Evidence that someone had been there. Evidence that kindness did not always vanish when people left. About 2 weeks later, he opened his door at sunrise and stopped. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Neatly stacked beside his woodpile was a fresh row of cut timber, at least half a cord, cleanly split, stacked with care. Not his work. Different blade marks. Different hands. He walked closer, running his fingers along the smooth-cut grain. Still fresh. Done sometime before dawn. No tracks remained except the faint impression of many feet carefully brushed away. Nearby hung a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. Inside he found dried meat, medicinal herbs, and a pair of hand-stitched winter gloves lined with fur. No note. No names. Just respect. Ethan allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind a man gives when he realizes he has been seen without asking to be. Over the following weeks, other signs appeared. A broken fence rail fixed before he noticed it. A sack of grain left near his shed after a storm. Once, after a heavy snowfall, he found a narrow path already cleared from his door to the well. Always silent. Always unseen. Spring finally arrived the way it always did, not with one grand moment, but with small changes that added up. Meltwater running down the rocks. Birds returning to the high branches. Green pushing carefully through the thawing earth. One evening Ethan stood near the cedar tree behind his cabin where the small wooden marker faced the sunset. He rested one hand against the weathered wood and spoke quietly into the warm air. You would have liked her. The wind moved softly through the branches as if answering. Later that same evening, he noticed something new. Tied carefully to the lower branch of the cedar was a single turquoise bead on a thin leather string. Simple and unmistakable. Not payment. Not decoration. A reminder. He did not remove it. Some things were meant to stay where they were given. As the light faded and the first stars appeared above the mountains, Ethan returned to his porch and sat with his coffee, watching the land settle into night. Out here, people rarely said thank you out loud. They did not need to. Because out here, gratitude did not come as words. It came as presence. And sometimes, if a man was lucky, it stayed long after the winter was gone.